That, if people want to get up a revolution, it is necessary for them to communicate with one another, but gossip will do the trick if people are determined. So being able to call for demonstrations by Facebook was good. It probably contributed to the unfoldment of events, but very few people in Tunisia and Egypt are wired. I think the percentage of Egyptians on Twitter is 1%, or at least it was during the revolution. So it could be important because, of course, those people who are on Twitter know people who aren't, and word spreads and so forth. I don't deny that. But I think there's been too much emphasis on that, and I think there's probably a bit of reflection phenomenon going on here where middle-class wired journalists in the West are looking for middle-class wired people in the Middle East to write about. And so many stories are missed. The Tunisia story, the myth that I told you about Mohamed Bouazizi is a working class story. It's a story about how hard it is to make a living in a bureaucratic, oppressive state. And there had been a big labor movement in South Tunisia around a mine, which had been put down brutally by the regime, and which the rest of the workers minded. There was a working class solidarity element to this thing. Likewise, in Egypt, one of the major groups that made the revolution in late January and the first half of February of 2010 was the April 6th movement, which is named for an attempt by textile workers in Helwan, north of Cairo, to strike. And the regime did not allow them to strike. Those of you who've seen the Battle of Algiers remember the scene where there's an attempt by shopkeepers to strike in Algiers, and the French forced them to open their shops. Well, the Mubarak regime did that to the textile workers. They forced them to go to work, and they didn't let them strike. They made the factories stay open on April 6th of 2008. But there was a kind of cross-class solidarity around that attempt at striking that was supported by blue-collar workers, white-collar office workers, you'll be amused, including, importantly, the tax collector union, and activist left-of-center college-educated people, whether students or recent graduates. That triangular alliance, leftist young intellectuals, workers, and white-collar office workers, was very important across the board in these revolutions. And we need to get to the bottom of that. And that's a story that I think is was not as frequently told. In fact, I think if you went back and looked at the press coverage of the Egyptian revolution, the textile workers who were very important in it are almost never mentioned. The workers were important because they struck in support of the demonstrations. And many of these demonstrations were held like on Wednesday. And it's difficult to get people to a demonstration in large numbers on a Wednesday because they're at work. But if the unions, the wildcat unions were formed and they struck, then the offices are closed, the factories are closed, people are freed up to go to the demonstrations. Then there's a rural element. And again, the Bouazizi myth is about a rural town. And there's a rural element in Egypt of massive proportions, which again was very little reported on. And I'm not blaming journalists for not reporting on it because they weren't out there in the boondocks and it would have been dangerous for them to be and so forth. But rural towns like Damanhur and even Asyut and Qana and Tanta and so forth in the south of the country in Upper Egypt joined in the revolution and played a role. They would cut down palm trees and bring carriages, and they would block the trunk road between Cairo and Aswan. There's only one really good metalled road down there, and the country's commerce doesn't run if that road is blocked, and they blocked it. In Asyut, they would set the palm trees on fire and protest. And a lot of what was going on in these rural cities with regard to supporting the revolution, the demand that Hosni Mubarak step down, was organized by the Muslim Brotherhood. So the urban revolution in Egypt was mostly spearheaded by these leftist students. And in Egyptian Arabic, you talk about the Thuwar, the revolutionaries. That's who they mean. They mean April 6th and Kafaya. They mean the left of center students. Those are the ones who are kind of, use the Tahrir Square demonstrations as their big tool of politics. They are, the Muslim Brotherhood is not considered Thuwar. They're not considered part of the revolutionary class. But in the rural areas, they did play that role, not in the urban areas so much. Likewise in Tunisia, I was in Tunisia and Egypt this summer. In Tunisia, I went to a meeting of a cultural center that brought in poets from each of the provinces of Tunisia. There were like 12 or so, and they were going to say, they said their poetry about the revolution, celebrating the revolution. And they were dressed in traditional rural dress. And their poetry was all about Moses and Pharaoh and God. And the people in Tunis were kind of shifting in their chairs during all this, because that wasn't their revolution. I mean, people in Tunis tend to be much more secular, and certainly the people who came to this cultural center. I had a sense that they just weren't expecting that kind of religious interpretation of the revolution as God's justice against Zaba as Pharaoh. That's not an interpretation that we heard very much in the press. But that, if you were out in the rural parts of Tunisia, Kairouan, for instance, that's what the revolution looked like out there. And so this is a way of saying that in many of these countries, including I think in Libya, a lot of times the initial urban demonstrations were led by the white-collar middle class. The next phase was what next? Well, they were very successful in getting rid of these dictators. We have 4 down. Some people think there are several more to go. But they were very successful in getting rid of the dictators. What next? Are these revolutions? That's another interpretive question for us. And of course, it depends very much on how you define revolution. I would argue they are revolutions in the sense that the ruling elites in these countries were very narrow and very rich. We don't know exactly, but people accused the Mubaraks of having $40 to $70 billion stashed away, the Qaddafis $200 billion. These may be exaggerations, but the tens of billions of dollars were stashed in Switzerland and elsewhere by these guys. And then there was a crony capitalist class around them. And so the U.S. Embassy in 2006 sent a cable, which we have courtesy Private Manning, which alleged that 50% of the economic elite of Tunisia was related to the president. That's nepotism on an enormous, I mean, maybe unprecedented scale. I don't know of another country that was ruled like that. So if you remove that elite, well, that's a social revolution. I mean, Thaddeus Gotchpal wondered whether the French Revolution was a social revolution because only 5% of properties changed hands. Well, far more than 5% of Tunisian property has already changed hands, I'm going to tell you that. And in Egypt, it's maybe not quite as high a percentage, but it's still significant. Those corrupt billionaires like Ahmed Ez and so forth are in jail, or many of them have fled the country. The property has been taken, and a billionaire in Egypt, in a country where 2/3 of the people make $2 a day or less, that's a lot of money. So I would argue that because of the narrowness and the extreme wealth concentration of these elites, that these not only are revolutions, but they're actually social revolutions. And you have to understand that, I would argue, to understand how popular they have been. Because people think that they were battened upon by a cartel, which was sucking resources out of them and blocking them economically. And they were. The estimates by some economists are the corruption in places like Tunisia and Egypt was taking 1 to 3 points a year off of economic growth. Well, if you had had that extra growth for the last 20 years, there wouldn't have been such high unemployment among educated people, and you might not have had revolutions. So the regimes were doing themselves in. And why was this situation there? Why were these regimes so narrow and so rich? And I would argue that that is, again, something that a historian can help with, because the social history of the modern Arab world really has had four phases, in my view. There's a colonial phase. When the place was ruled by the French and the British primarily. The Italians were in Libya. And during the colonial phase, often new forms of private property and property law were introduced, of which local elites took advantage. And you got a phenomenon of the hacienda. That period of the Middle East was very much like Nicaragua and Central America and so forth. You had very small groups of landlords, a few thousand families typically, who owned as much as 50% of the good land in the country. And this was true in Egypt, it was true in Iraq, and so forth. And then you have an anti-colonial and a post-colonial phase in which that's undone. So 1956, the Abdel Nasser regime, having come to power, does land reform in Egypt. Abdul Karim Qasim makes the military coup in 1958 and then does land reform in Iraq. And so you create rural middle classes, you distribute landed property much more equitably. And these regimes are popular because they do this. But then at the same time, they do import substitution, they do state-led industrialization, and they move these societies from being mainly agrarian societies, now more equal than they had been, to being much more urban, and in fact majority urban now in most instances. And at that point, the loyalty that they got, these regimes, from their rural middle classes that they created by land reform, becomes much less important. And the question is, can they gain and keep the loyalty of the urban classes? And here, the state-led industrialization, the very large public sectors that you had, really not quite on an East Bloc level, but still 50% of the Egyptian economy was in state hands in the 60s and 70s. Wasn't necessarily bad for people. The average wage of the average worker doubled in Egypt between 1960 and 1970. That created a kind of internal constituency for the government. When Mubarak first came to power in Egypt, he gave a speech in which he made it clear that he was governing to provide goodies to the people he employed. And of course, he employed 50% of the country. Well, the next phase was neoliberalism, because first of all, state-led industrialization, any kind of economic program that produces progress, runs into a problem after a while of you've already done the things that would spur growth, and so you get a leveling off. And in the 70s, 80s, you get this leveling off. And in the meantime, a Washington consensus had grown up that any kind of socialist policies, any kind of welfare, any kind of interference with the market is bad. And enormous pressure begins being put on US and British and French clients in the Middle East to privatize. They privatize their state-owned factories, privatize and go to a market system. And this neoliberal phase creates the opportunity then for a kind of insider trading. Because, just to give you an example, in 2004, the Egyptian state privatized the Egyptian Steel Company. Well, the Egyptian Steel Company only had one